Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Master Channel. Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
I remember the early days of my life, growing up surrounded by the rugged beauty of Colorado's mountains. My father, a stern but loving man, worked as a foreman at a local mining company, while my mother, a quiet and thoughtful woman, managed our home and kept us boys in line. My brothers and I spent countless summers exploring the woods, playing by the streams, and learning the skills that would one day define our paths. They, with their natural inclination toward structure and discipline, chose careers in the military. I, on the other hand, felt a pull toward the earth itself, which led me down the winding path of geology. It was in college where I met Susan, a woman who seemed as fascinated by human behavior as I was by the formations beneath our feet. She was a sociology major with an insatiable curiosity about the hidden workings of communities. We connected during a campus symposium on interdisciplinary studies, and from that day forward, our paths intertwined. I was captivated not just by her intellect, but by the mystery that seemed to shroud her past, a subject she skillfully dodged with gentle deflections and an enigmatic smile. Despite this, our bond grew strong, and before long we were married, ready to face the world with our shared ambitions and separate dreams. Years passed as I pursued my career in the oil industry, a field both challenging and rewarding. Susan, meanwhile, followed her academic passion, diving into graduate studies that took her deeper into the realms of sociology and psychology. Her dedication to research was impressive, yet it came with a shadow of detachment that only deepened as she moved closer to completing her doctoral work. I often reassured myself that this distance was just part of the journey, a phase we'd push through together. Little did I know how profoundly this research, which had always been a point of pride, would eventually shape our lives in unforeseen and painful ways. Sitting in the dim light of our living room, a gnawing discomfort settled deep within me. This wasn't the first time I'd felt so isolated, though each moment seemed more piercing than the last. I couldn't pinpoint the root of my unease, but it was intricately tied to the months she spent immersed in her field study, far away in Utah. My wife, Susan, had recently returned from 2 arduous months of fieldwork dedicated to her sociology PhD. Now she was locked in an endless cycle of research and writing, pouring every waking hour into her thesis, while I found myself grappling with the growing chasm that had formed between us. I resented her silence and her refusal to engage in conversations that mattered. Despite my efforts, Susan remained aloof and unyielding to my attempts at rekindling our connection. You might wonder why I'm worried. Let me explain, so you can see why. Her background was a mystery. Raised by her mother, who never spoke of Susan's father, she didn't share much about her past. I respected her silence, but now it felt significant. I have 2 brothers in the military and parents in Colorado, whom we visit occasionally. I had just returned from 9 weeks in West Africa for oil exploration, while Susan had been in Utah for her research. We left home the same day and reunited recently. When I returned, she greeted me coldly, saying, "Welcome back to the States." She quickly mentioned needing to focus on her thesis, and had even put a lock on the den door to avoid interruptions. This felt unnecessary, but I agreed to respect her space. She hadn't informed me of her extended stay. When I questioned her, she claimed she couldn't contact me due to the isolated nature of the community. Yet, she had her laptop and phone card, so her excuse didn't add up. I'd tried to reach her via email, but she never responded, and the university couldn't help either. I was worried, I told her, but she dismissed it, saying, "You were away." She shared almost nothing about her time in Utah. I knew she'd stayed with a local family and had somehow gained the trust of a secretive community. Her project focused on a splinter group from the Mormon Church, but she wouldn't elaborate on how she managed to extend her stay. She insisted her work was crucial and complex, but kept details to herself. "I'll tell you everything someday after my thesis is done," she said, offering no comfort. The secrecy was new and unsettling. For the first time in our marriage, I felt she was hiding something significant. The first thing I noticed when I returned was Susan's change in appearance. She used to dress like any 26-year-old, stylish but not overly revealing. She wore skirts just above the knee, jeans and pantsuits, always adding makeup and perfume. Now, her clothes were ultra-conservative, ankle-length dresses buttoned to the neck in plain colors like gray and blue. She even styled her hair into a bun instead of letting it flow naturally. She stopped using makeup and perfume, and her new look was drab and unappealing. When I mentioned how much I disliked her new style, she brushed it off. "It helps me stay in the mindset for my thesis work," she said, ignoring my frustration. Nights were equally distant. She wore plain cotton nightgowns and rejected any closeness. "I can't risk my emotions interfering with my work," she said. I grew tired of her rejection and often turned my back to avoid more frustration. Our relationship felt hollow, but Susan only focused on her work. She claimed she needed to avoid anything that could disrupt her memory of the research. Her thesis professor had her attention, but I, her husband, felt invisible. Susan had come back with a stomach issue, keeping crackers by the bed for morning nausea. Despite my suggestions, she refused to see a doctor, saying she felt better after a few weeks. When I mentioned a colleague's concern about hepatitis, she dismissed it. "I'm fine now," she said. Her involvement in household tasks dwindled, citing her thesis deadline as the reason. I reminded her that she had 2 more years to complete it, but she insisted on finishing now to return to teaching by fall. "I need my degree ready," she said. This sudden urgency was straining our marriage. We had always discussed decisions together, but now she avoided deep conversations, closeness, and even basic planning. When I offered to help with finding a teaching position, she snapped, "I don't need your interference." I felt excluded, my anxiety growing as Susan isolated herself. Stress even started affecting my health, and medication offered little relief. The only stable part of my life was my job as a geologist. Our home was filled with tension and superficial conversations. I turned to playing my cello for solace, but the loneliness was suffocating. One evening, I tried asking about her living conditions in Utah. She reacted sharply. "Ethan, stop asking me about this. I'll tell you when the thesis is done," she said, exasperated. Our exchanges ended in frustration, and she retreated to her den, locking the door behind her. Our life together was falling apart piece by piece. My patience was running thin, and my anger became more obvious. Yet, I had to accept not having a real partner or answers about her life. Days turned into months, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Doubts about our marriage crept in, unsettling me. "Do you have concerns like mine?" I once asked her. "Changes in my methodology required many adjustments," she'd say. "I found new information that needed discussing with my committee, complicating everything." "Susan, can't you tell me what this new information is? How did you get it?" I pleaded. "I'm worried you'll get too emotional if I tell you. It would negatively affect my recording of my feelings," she replied curtly. I muttered to myself, already disliking what little I knew about the polygamous community she studied. How could sharing details worsen my feelings when I already resented their influence on her? "I'd only react badly if you were involved in their practices," I said, trying to gauge her reaction. She avoided answering, saying, "I used unconventional methods to get my information." I felt her secrecy was more stressful than just being honest. "It will all be clear when the time is right," she insisted. 5 months without closeness passed. Before, we had a healthy, loving bed life. Now, even light affection was denied. I couldn't understand how avoiding closeness was related to her research. If it was, then what exactly had her research involved? I asked her directly, "Did you do anything that might damage our marriage or violate our promises?" She snapped, "I won't discuss this until my dissertation is done." Realizing I had a serious marital problem, I voiced my anger. "You've been back for months, and you can't reassure me of your fidelity." Her defensive body language made her silence even more unsettling. Our relationship, once full of trust, was unraveling. I missed her warmth, but she remained distant, focusing solely on her thesis. I reached a breaking point. "Susan, you're tearing apart our trust. Our marriage is at risk, and it's on you," I shouted. Frustrated, I left to cool off, wondering if I'd have to plan a future without her. Determined, I decided to investigate on my own. Her changes, conservative dress, no makeup, no perfume, and locking herself away, felt foreign and wrong. Our once loving relationship was eroding, replaced by resentment and anxiety. From that point, she showed no real interest in me. Nights passed without affection. I stopped asking questions, and she kept the den locked when working. Her explanation, "I need to avoid interference." "It feels like you're shutting me out," I said. "It's not important," she dismissed. But the openness we once promised was gone. Our marriage was unrecognizable. Susan's behavior and secrecy were getting under my skin. She now kept her computer locked with a password. When I asked her about it, she snapped, saying, "You have your own computer. Stay off mine." Her defensiveness only raised my suspicions. She claimed I might accidentally delete her work, but I pointed out she should be backing up her files regularly. She turned away, ending the conversation. The secrecy between us created a growing sense of distrust. I told her this, but she dismissed it. Our communication was almost non-existent, which worried me more than anything else. I emphasized how much she had changed since starting her research project, but her response was always the same. She was busy completing her dissertation. "I need you now, Susan. Not later," I said, frustrated. She just asked me to hold on, explaining how complex her research had become. Despite promising her thesis was almost done, she gave no timeline and then would lock herself back in the den. My job as a geologist kept me busy commuting and working from home, but I shared my concerns with my boss. He suggested I speak with Susan's thesis advisor. That seemed like a solid plan, so I set up an appointment. Meanwhile, I checked our bank and credit card statements and found no unusual charges from her time in Utah, except the bus fare. I wondered if she had a university account for expenses, which I planned to confirm. I contacted a tech expert at work for help accessing Susan's computer. He offered to assist me in person, and we planned for him to come by when Susan would be at a thesis meeting the following week. Meeting Professor Young, Susan's advisor, I learned she did have a university account for expenses, but he wasn't sure if she had used it. He confirmed her research took unexpected turns that required major revisions, but wouldn't provide details, suggesting Susan and I needed a candid discussion. He emphasized the importance of forgiveness in marriage, deepening my anxiety. He also mentioned that while her ultra-conservative dress was noted, it wasn't significant. I asked about her living arrangements, knowing she couldn't commute due to the lack of motels nearby. He didn't have specifics, but suggested I discuss it with Susan. His attempts to reassure me fell flat. My concerns were only growing. Professor Young said Susan would present her findings and methodology to her committee the following week, including details about her living arrangements. He mentioned that while she could share any personal details with me, he couldn't discuss them without her consent. He found it unusual that Susan had asked him not to talk to me about those arrangements, but he reassured me that secrecy in research was common, though her level of secrecy from me was unusual. As I thanked him and prepared to leave, he encouraged me to consider pursuing a PhD, learning of my strong academic background. I declined, knowing the stress it had caused my marriage. We parted amicably, and the secretary handed me Susan's account records, emphasizing they were confidential. Driving home, I felt more anxious than ever. My concerns grew, but there was still no concrete evidence of infidelity, only suspicion. I secured the file without mentioning my meeting to Susan. This was the first time I kept important information from her, adding to my guilt. Our conversation that evening was light, but I expressed frustration about how her behavior was straining our marriage. She claimed she was under immense pressure and promised to share everything after her thesis was approved. Tuesday arrived, and Susan dressed in her usual conservative outfit, even for her thesis defense. I urged her to dress more professionally, but she brushed it off, saying appearances didn't matter in her field. After she left, I met with my tech friend, who accessed and copied all her computer files, emails, and deleted data, ensuring no traces were left. That evening, Susan returned in high spirits, saying her thesis was accepted for publication and all academic requirements were completed. Despite her excitement, when I tried to embrace her, she pulled away, saying she couldn't yet. I was stunned and demanded answers, frustrated with her continued emotional distance. She asked for another week to settle the grant's financials before talking, but I exploded in anger. "Why a week? You could do this online in minutes." After a heated argument, I agreed to the delay, but warned her that any further excuses would end in divorce. I stormed out to clear my head, knowing I was at my limit. This extra week gave me time to review her files and accounts. I was determined to uncover the truth, whatever it took. That night was rough. I struggled to sleep and kept waking Susan with my tossing. When I woke early the next morning, my arm rested on her stomach. As I moved my hand, I felt a small, firm bump. Something was different. My mind raced, and a horrifying realization hit me. She was pregnant, and it couldn't be my child. She hadn't needed her birth control pills, which I now remembered hadn't been around since she returned. Fueled by rage, I shook her awake. She screamed, startled. I demanded the truth, shouting that her secrecy was over and she needed to confess. I stormed out, slammed the door, and tried to calm myself with coffee. My anger was uncontrollable. I yelled for her to come out, telling her this was her last chance before everything ended. Susan came out in a nightgown, looking scared. I asked if she knew she was pregnant. She nodded, explaining she found out right after she returned and didn't tell me because she couldn't face it. She needed to finish her thesis quickly, knowing she'd have to confront me about the pregnancy and our marriage. I accused her of lying and betraying me. My anger surged and I spat on the table, expressing my disgust. She sat in silence, ashamed. Finally, she admitted, "I think the pregnancy is from an attack. Henry, the head of the family, forced me into a series of attacks and later coerced submission. I couldn't escape. His wives kept watch, and his brother, the sheriff, would have brought me back." My anger lessened as the reality of her attacks sank in, but I pressed her for more answers. "Why did you keep up with this secrecy, the refusal of closeness, and your changed behavior? There has to be more." She wept, asking to tell me everything in the order she had planned. I agreed reluctantly, needing to know the full story to understand what had happened to us. Susan's eyes pleaded with me, and I softened. "You need to tell me everything now, not over weeks. All of it today, understood?" "Yes, everything today, I promise," she said. I warned her that I'd been digging, speaking to her professor, and copying her computer files. "You have one chance to be honest," I said, setting up a tape recorder and disconnecting the phones to avoid interruptions. I took both our cell phones, turning them off. Susan began, "Let me tell you where I came from. You never pushed for details, and I never felt ready to share. My mother was the fourth wife in a polygamous family in southern Utah. When I was 11, she fled with me, leaving everything behind. We hid in a boxcar and escaped to Colorado, where Mom rebuilt our life, never dating or remarrying. You know the rest." We took a break and went for a walk, holding hands for the first time in months. When we returned to the table, Susan resumed, "My childhood greatly influenced my academic pursuits. Visiting that town meant going back to my roots. I wasn't entirely unknown. People recognized me, but suspicion was evident. Earning trust was essential." She continued, "Henry, the head of the family, was tall, powerful, and authoritative. He imposed strict rules. I had to remove my wedding ring, which he kept. He destroyed my computer and took my money, as women were forbidden to have such possessions. I realized I was more of a captive than a guest. I agreed to his conditions to stay and conduct my research. Losing my computer plunged me into isolation when I returned, as I had to recreate my notes and experiences from memory. It was exhausting and intensified my anxiety, though it was only one aspect of my overall stress. Her story was far from over, and I braced myself for more revelations. Susan resumed, her voice controlled, almost as if she were reading from a prepared script. "I agreed to adhere to all the community's rules and not disrupt their way of life. This was necessary for my research. You may wonder why Henry, an influential leader, would allow an outsider like me into his home. It was because of our familial connection, though not by blood. Henry, who was 20 years older than me, assumed leadership of the family after my father passed away. When I arrived, I was assigned a bed in the attic with the other wives, while Henry had his own room downstairs. I was expected to work as the wives did, dress like them, and follow their rules. The first wife monitored my activities, provided necessities, and assigned me tasks." Susan paused for a moment, then continued. "When my suitcase was searched, the first wife discovered my birth control pills and threw them out, declaring them against God's will. Deodorant, lipstick, Tylenol, and other items were confiscated as well. I accepted this, convincing myself that I wouldn't need the pills while away from you. I hoped that my compliance would help me build trust and advance my research." She shifted slightly in her seat. "By the second week, Henry announced during a private family meeting that I would become his fourth wife, a decision over which I had no control. My protests were in vain. He overpowered me and forced my compliance. The other wives stood by, unable to help due to their own fear. Henry threatened me, making it clear that disobedience was not an option. The next morning he told the children I was now a mother figure and added me to the household duties. At night, he enforced his dominance and control. Over time, my initial resistance waned, and I adjusted to the role. To my dismay, I even began to accept and, at times, appreciate the dynamic. It was a stark contrast to what we shared. This duality made the experience even more unsettling and conflicted." Susan's eyes focused on a distant point as she spoke. "After a month, I was allowed to join community visits and was introduced as Henry's fourth wife. I learned about their rigid social structure and began creating lesson plans for homeschooling, which had to be approved by the male-only town council. This access provided deep insights into their way of life, and advanced my research significantly. Her voice softened. Being accepted as a submissive wife enabled me to gather more information than I ever expected. Henry would often stress that men should treat their wives as he did. While this experience was invaluable for my study, it came at a significant personal cost. She paused, taking a break. I sat in shock, feeling detached from her story. It felt like I was listening to a stranger recounting events from a foreign place, not my wife sharing painful memories. I felt detached, listening as if Susan were a stranger telling an intriguing story. I controlled my anger as she continued, skipping questions for now. She returned with a notebook, explaining, I wrote notes to guide this talk. First, know that I've always loved you, though it has changed. I need to tell you how I left Henry's family. She recounted, Rebecca, Henry's 12-year-old daughter, had her birthday, but she was unusually withdrawn after talking to her mother and friends. That night, while Henry was with his first wife, I saw my chance. I retrieved my hidden credit card from my old shoes, put on my coat, and left quietly. I left a note for Henry saying I needed to publish my research. I knew I had to be far away by dawn, so I walked the familiar road my mother and I had fled 15 years ago. After several miles, a passing car gave me a ride to the bus station. I dug up my hidden money and headed home to record my findings. Susan paused, then said, I needed isolation to recall my experiences accurately. That's why I kept my distance from you. Now comes the harder part. I listened as Susan admitted, I've been torn between two lives. Life with Henry, though it began as something forced, became enjoyable over time. I adapted to being his submissive fourth wife and even grew to like it. The routine became comfortable and I found certain aspects of it fulfilling. Our bed life was wild and different from ours, which I came to miss. I know that's hard for you to hear, but it's the truth. I'm now at a crossroads. I need to decide whether to stay with you or go back to Henry, who said he would take me back if I return with money after completing my PhD. I need time to choose which life to pursue, the tender one I have with you or the structured, communal living with him. I'm asking for your patience while I make this choice. Susan's eyes narrowed as she added, I've told my thesis committee everything, even about my involvement in the dom-sub relationship. They know that I'm pregnant, but to them, it's purely academic. I'm set to receive my PhD, and that's what matters. Now I'm ready to answer any questions you have, and I hope you'll remain civil, as I have been today. I paused, working to control my anger. The information I had found on her computer and financial records didn't matter anymore. The recording I made was enough. I stopped it, took a deep breath, and locked eyes with her, speaking calmly despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. You overlooked something important in your plans. Decisions have consequences, and you left me out of yours. You broke your vows to me, to our family, and to God. You took another man as a lover and are now carrying his child. Your choices have destroyed our marriage. I continued. Staying with me is not an option. Tomorrow I'll be seeing a divorce lawyer. Your future choices are now limited. Go back to Henry, live as a single mother like your mother did, or move on alone. I will not support you or the child either financially or emotionally. You've been living independently for months and now it's official. Our relationship is over. Susan's expression hardened as she responded, I have my grant money and a book advance. I don't need your help. I can manage on my own. I met her gaze and replied, You used me, Susan. My income supported your betrayal, disguised as research. You married me as a means to an end. You've shattered my trust and broken my heart, and it seems you don't even care. Your declaration of love was the biggest lie told by the only woman I ever loved. She shook her head. Ethan, I've always loved you. I wanted you to stay faithful and prove your love by not complaining. You wanted my love while betraying me? I shouted. You wanted me to feel more pain when you left? You and Henry deserve each other. You've become like him, a manipulative monster. I was furious that Susan shared everything with her academic peers, but kept me in the dark. It confirmed I was never truly important to her. Susan, I said, my anger mixed with hurt, are you really going back to him? Do you know what your penance will be? He'll likely beat you to make an example of you and you won't escape again. If he eliminates you, they'll call it natural causes. You'd risk your life and your unborn child's. I want no part of that, or you. I didn't know if what I said was true. I just wanted to scare her. You told me he was powerful and controlling. Be careful. He'll have no guilt damaging you or his child. I couldn't understand how someone as intelligent as Susan could choose that life. Was she mentally ill? The room darkened as I felt the weight of defeat. This morning, I was just angry. Now I'm tired and done. I'm numb. But at least I have closure. From now on, I only care about how I'll rebuild my life without you. You no longer matter to me. Emotionally drained, I felt broken and exhausted. My love had been betrayed, and I wanted her out of my life. I walked out to clear my mind, determined that she would face the consequences of her choices. But I wasn't done with Henry. I planned to deal with him. I slept on the couch and took family leave the next morning. Susan had made coffee. "Enjoy it while you can," I said. "You'll have none when you're back with him. You might get the dominant life you want, but this house will be mine. I made the payments, and I won't let you take it with your $50,000. It's going on the market today." I had plans for Henry, but kept them to myself. "Prepare to find another place. I'm moving to the corporate apartment today and taking the rest of my things soon. We'll only talk through lawyers now." I handed her a paper with my lawyer's contact and returned her cell phone. I packed in silence, took the tapes for any divorce issues, and left without saying goodbye. She was just an object to me now. The dark months were behind me. I headed to the bank, a realtor, and a divorce lawyer, then to my parents' house for something stored in the attic. I had plans to make and justice to serve. Freedom had a high price, and Henry would pay for crossing me. The next day was filled with tasks. I closed my bank accounts and moved the funds to new accounts in the city. I canceled our credit card and applied for a new one. I scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer and arranged for time off work. My boss, aware of my situation, offered help, but all I needed was my paycheck redirected and some leave. I instructed the office to give Susan my new number if she called. By day's end, I was exhausted. The following day, I returned to the house. Susan was gone, so I collected the tape recorder, tapes, books, clothes, tools, pictures, and my cello. I contacted the realtor with my new information, but learned Susan's signature was needed to list the house. I left her a note with my new phone number, stating I wanted to talk. Not about the divorce, but about Henry. Gathering intel on him became my priority. I then met with the divorce lawyer, presenting the tapes and computer files. I insisted on a 50-50th split, including Susan's book advance and any future profits. I refused alimony or child support and wanted her to relinquish my last name. After paying the initial legal fees, I felt the cost of freedom was worth it. That evening, Susan called to talk, and we arranged to meet at a diner the next day. I slept well for the first time in months, feeling focused and determined. Susan was already a part of my past. The following morning, I packed for visits to my parents and her mother after seeing Susan. At the diner, Susan wore a modern maternity dress with light makeup and looked healthier. A bruise marked her cheek, but she seemed more like her old self. I greeted her and noted her return to modern attire. "Ethan," she began, "I want to apologize for my words the other day." "Susan," I responded, "it wasn't how you said it, but what you did. We're heading for divorce, and I'm sure you'll agree to the terms. This will free you to return to Henry or live as a single mother, and it frees me of any responsibility. I can't forgive the infidelity, though I understand there were circumstances. You didn't fight back, and that's something I struggle to reconcile. But I came here for information, not to revisit your intimate details. I need to know your daily life there, Henry's work, and the location of the community. Leave the rest out." The waitress served us, and we ate in silence until Susan spoke. "Ethan, I plan to return to Henry in the next few days to discuss the terms of going back. You made me worry that he might hurt me, but I need to find out for myself. I also need to see if our marriage is truly beyond saving. My heart is still torn between you and Henry." "Susan," I said, "our marriage is over. Your divided loyalty shattered mine. The fact that you're even considering another man seals it. Maybe one day you'll understand the pain you've caused. Infidelity isn't just physical. I hope you never face what I've felt. I had your loyalty and you sacrificed it for a degree and excitement. Remember, you vowed to be true in front of everyone, including God. I, Ethan Allen, am not part of your future. This discussion isn't about us. It's about your life there, your routines, and who you interacted with. Any talk of our relationship goes through my lawyer." She pursed her lips. "You don't have to be so harsh. The world already has enough hate. Let's move on to what you want to know." Susan detailed their daily schedules, the roles of the wives and children, and Henry's routines. I kept my intentions hidden, not wanting Henry to sense any threat. His arrogance and dominance wouldn't let him imagine an outsider targeting him. I learned Henry was deeply religious and superstitious, believing in angels and visions. He was proud and had frequent, even multiple physical encounters with his wives each day. Susan mentioned she enjoyed trying to keep up with him, a remark clearly meant to provoke and humiliate me. I stayed silent. Henry was a respected town leader, known for dominating his family and wives, admired by other men for his assertiveness. He had no patience for less dominant men and allowed no interference in his life. To me, he was a control freak. I briefly wondered what he thought of me, but dismissed it. He's nothing but trouble, I thought. His pride would lead to a fall, and I looked forward to seeing it happen. I told Susan goodbye without a handshake and wished her luck with Henry. I had a 6-hour drive ahead and planned to stay overnight. My first stop was Susan's mother's house, an hour away. Although we weren't especially close, she greeted me warmly. We sat at the kitchen table, and I broke the news. "Susan is pregnant," I said. She smiled and congratulated me, not knowing the full story. I then explained everything that had happened over the past 6 months. Shocked, she said, "I had no idea." She only knew Susan was on a research project, but not its nature or location. She was stunned and tearful when I finished. "I can't believe she would go back to that place," she said, shaking her head. To her, Susan's return was like reliving a painful escape. "We fled for a reason, Ethan. Why would she choose this?" she said, tears streaming. Her pain mirrored my own, and we hugged, sharing the sorrow of losing the same person. We cried together, finding solace in shared grief. The embrace lasted as the sun set, shadows wrapping around us. Finally, exhausted, we parted. "You should stay the night," she said. I accepted, grateful for the comfort. After breakfast and coffee, I continued my drive to my parents' home. "I'll stay in touch," I promised her. She was beautiful, inside and out, and I realized how much Susan had been like her mother, until Henry. My anger toward him grew stronger. While crossing the Colorado-Utah state line, I called my parents. No answer at home, so I tried Dad's cell. "Hey, son," he answered. "Hi, Dad. Where are you? I'm coming over." "We're at your brother's. Join us. It's been too long." I decided to extend my trip to visit my brother and his wife. Before heading there, I checked into a motel. My brother, recently back from Afghanistan as an infantry company commander, greeted me warmly. "Ethan, great to see you," he said, hugging me. After family greetings and hugs, I said, "Can we all sit for a bit? I need some family time." Mom, concerned, asked, "Is everything okay?" "It's serious," I replied. "Let's order some food. It's a long story." We ordered pizza and settled in. I began, "Susan and I are divorcing." Mom's eyes welled up. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered. Dad's face was tense. "Is there no way to work it out?" I shook my head and explained Susan's research, her changed behavior, the pregnancy, and our strained relationship. Silence followed, broken by Mom's quiet sobs. Dad held her, eyes glistening. My brother, tense, paced before saying, "Ethan, let's go for a walk." He took my hand and led me out. We called to say we'd return in an hour. In the car, he spoke firmly. "You're in a battle now, one you didn't choose. Listen to me." "What do you mean?" I asked. "There are rules to winning. Know your enemy, his strengths and weaknesses. Use your strengths against him. Choose your timing and strike decisively. Keep plans secret and act fast. Minimize collateral damage." He looked at me seriously. "Plan well and rely only on yourself." I nodded. "I will." "Good. Keep this between us. Now, let's get back," he said, turning the car around. The next morning after breakfast, Mom and Dad headed home, and I followed, needing to retrieve something hidden in their attic. Spending a few days in my old room brought strange comfort. Mom started to recover emotionally, and Dad and I had long talks about my future, though I kept my true plans private. When it was time to move on, Dad said, "We'll be back soon," as they left for Walmart. I went to the attic, found what I needed, and loaded it into my SUV. The next day, I set out, not home, but to my apartment. My boss had been pushing for me to join another expedition, and without Susan, it felt easier to commit. "I'll be away for 2 months in the equatorial Atlantic," I informed my parents. "Be safe, son," Mom said, eyes full of worry. "I will," I assured her. With 3 months of unused leave, I returned to Utah, storing the tool I had packed and picking up furniture from my former house to place in storage. I studied satellite maps of Henry's town and the surrounding area, meticulously planning. I wanted to confront Henry, teach him a lesson, not liquidate him immediately. A headshot would be too quick. He needed to suffer and be humiliated, with no evidence tracing back to me. I wanted him to know it was Susan's husband who had done it. I also planned justice for Susan. I found a tough lawyer through my boss and instructed him to threaten the university with a lawsuit over condoning her unethical research. I wanted to draw the Board of Trustees' attention. The university responded quickly to the $20 million lawsuit threat, stating Susan's degree hadn't been finalized yet. I demanded that Susan's research be rejected entirely and that the decision be irreversible. There would be no compromise. Within 2 weeks, my lawyer received a copy of the Board of Trustees' unanimous resolution. It directed the university president to amend the Department of Social Sciences findings, reprimand those who approved Susan's research, and deny her degree. Additionally, the board included a stipulation barring her from using any of her research for academic purposes. They even informed the publisher that the university's name could not be linked to her book and froze her research grant account. I was satisfied. Weeks later, I learned they couldn't reach Susan to inform her of the decision. The university contacted my lawyer for her contact details. I provided her divorce lawyer's information, her mother's address, and Henry's address. Susan wasn't at our former home, and I wondered about her whereabouts. Despite my anger, I was concerned for her and the unborn child's safety. I planned another part of my strategy carefully. A message from God for Henry, styled like the Declaration of Independence with scripture quotes to intimidate him. I printed it on high-quality linen paper and placed the pages in a formal album, ensuring no fingerprints remained. Knowing Henry's superstitions, I was confident this would unnerve him and make him accept it as divine will. I felt proud of my plan, following my brother's advice to use strengths against weaknesses. I then shifted focus to my planned trips, including a visit to Henry, followed by continuing to Africa. My plan was to appear and disappear like an avenging angel, executing my strategy with precision. For success, I studied and practiced in total secrecy, aided by the internet for private research. I meticulously studied the maps and pinpointed Henry's farmland, knowing what crops he grew and when he worked the land. With access to high-resolution satellite images, far better than those available publicly, I used my expertise as a geologist to interpret topography with precision. I could see field details down to the depth of tractor tire tracks and knew Henry's preferred resting spot under a solitary tree near a ridge. The ridge, just 8 feet high, was perfect for concealment, with an access road leading to a county road a couple of miles away. The setup was ideal. I had chosen my battlefield. Weeks of intense planning and research followed, including studies in human anatomy and surgical techniques. I learned that removing both testicles would drastically reduce a man's sexual drive, while removing only one would allow enough testosterone for sexual desire, but without satisfaction. My plan was for Henry to retain his sexual energy, but live with unfulfilled frustration. He took my wife. I would take his ability for pleasure. The concept of justice, an eye for an eye, resonated with me. Though I liked my plan, the risk of getting caught and facing prison kept me focused and precise. I made multiple trips to various stores, buying supplies piece by piece. From an online theatrical supply store, I ordered makeup and a full gray beard. Oversized shoes came from a thrift shop. My preparation was meticulous. One morning, my lawyer interrupted my planning. Susan has signed the divorce papers and isn't contesting them, he informed me. I didn't even have to appear in court. The papers were filed, starting the mandatory 60-day waiting period. My lawyer informed hers about the university's decision, but he already knew and had told Susan. She had apparently lost it. She'd completely unraveled upon hearing the news. She had lost her cherished degree. Her research had been discredited, and now she was a single pregnant woman about to have a child out of wedlock. I spoke to her mother, who told me Susan was devastated. She's been falling apart since then, her mother said with a heavy sigh. Did you have a hand in this? I did, I admitted. Tell Susan I pushed the university's decision as payback for her infidelity and 5 months of a marriage without closeness, I added. I hate that this is hurting you too. There's always collateral damage. I genuinely regretted Susan's mother being caught in the aftermath, but it was Susan who set these events in motion. Our house went up for sale and sold quickly. We split the equity evenly as outlined in the divorce papers. Susan didn't want to stay there, and I didn't care where she went. She might stay with her mother, but that was no concern of mine. The strangest part of it all was that I had lost my interest in sex. My energy was entirely absorbed by my project. I wondered if this was how Susan felt while she worked on her thesis. I hoped my desires would return, but wasn't worried. Susan had been my only partner, and now I didn't want anyone, not even her. During this time, I continued to visit the office regularly and worked with my boss on pre-trip preparations. The Eastern Atlantic oil field survey wasn't finished, and my expertise was needed in Africa soon. This would serve as my perfect alibi, should I need one. I had to let my tech-savvy friend in on my plan. This worried me, but it was necessary. I explained everything, and he laughed until tears rolled down his face. "Let's get on with it," he said, still laughing. Using updated photos and his FBI contacts, he obtained blank, authentic U.S. passports and realistic certificates. From these, he made fake driver's licenses and passports. One passport had my photo with his name and vice versa. This way, we each had 2 passports, one real and one swapped. We also created fake driver's licenses. With my supplies, I went to Central Utah for target practice with the tool I'd brought from Africa. My accuracy came back quickly. It was like riding a bike, just needing practice. My plan was falling into place. I spent time with my friend coordinating our international travel. We were set to meet in South Africa. The arrangements fell into place without a hitch. I packed my SUV and drove to Colorado, where I rented a storage unit to store the vehicle. Using my fake Colorado ID, I rented an old car and paid cash. From that point on, I wore gloves. I bought 4 used tires and had them fitted to the rental car, paying in cash to leave no record. I purchased a prepaid phone with my fake ID and called my friend, who had also bought a disposable phone. Our calls would be hard to trace if it came to that. I was officially on vacation, so no one questioned my movements. My friend was ready to play his part in creating the alibi. When Henry faced his reckoning, I'd be in Africa. Timing was critical. I loaded my car with supplies and double-checked everything. The tool, ammunition, surgical tools, camouflage, food, water, documents, money, and passports. I confirmed with my friend, who was eager and ready. My company had booked my flight to Africa for the 10th, but I planned to leave Colorado on the 12th using my friend's identity. He would fly to New York and then South Africa on the 10th, using the passport with my name and his face. "Keep all your airport receipts," I reminded him. "I will," he replied. He would return to the U.S. on his real passport after we met. I'd use the fake passport for the first leg and my real one for continuing to Angola. He would take my luggage, traveling light himself. On the 10th, my friend boarded his flight and called to confirm. My alibi was set. A rush of satisfaction hit me. My target was within reach. Justice was on its way to southern Utah. Wearing gloves, I drove to the location and changed into my disguise. Old coveralls, a red long-sleeved shirt, an unremarkable hat, a full fake beard, and shoes with the outer rear of one heel filed down. I put in brown contact lenses. I drove through the town, making sure I was seen. I might have glimpsed Susan, but I couldn't be sure. I hoped it was her. I wanted her to see that justice was being served. I left without speaking to anyone. That night I set up at my pre-chosen spot, 20 yards from Henry's favorite spot under the lone tree. I checked everything, using desert camouflage for cover and verifying my supplies. The dart tool, built for tranquilizing African wildlife, was set, calibrated for a 300-pound animal. I knew Henry weighed around 280. As expected, Henry came to work in the field and by noon rested under the tree. I aimed and fired. The dart hit his gluteus maximus. He jumped and tried to brush it off, but it was too late. I stepped out from my tent, now wearing a white robe and no beard. I wanted Henry to see my face clearly. In 20 seconds, he would be unconscious. "Henry," I called as I walked toward him. "God has heard the cries of Ethan Allen, Susan's rightful husband. You have sinned. I am the avenging angel sent to deliver God's judgment." Henry's eyes widened in terror as he tried to speak but couldn't. He fell to his knees, succumbing to the tranquilizer. I moved in close so my face would be the last thing he saw before he blacked out. His eyes glazed over and he collapsed. I was alone with Henry. The moment I had waited for was finally here. Henry tried to stand but collapsed to his knees, eyes wide with fear. He tried to speak but couldn't. I moved close, making sure my face was right in front of his so he would clearly see me and remember this moment as the last thing before everything changed. His eyes began to glaze over, and within seconds, he was unconscious. No one had seen or heard anything. The quiet around us was undisturbed. I wasn't a violent man, but Henry lay unconscious as his painful ordeal began. Henry was mine. I stood over him triumphant. If I had given him a lethal dose and he died, that would have been fine, but it wasn't my goal. I moved quickly, descending on him like a spider on its prey. I unsnapped his coveralls and pulled them down to his ankles. There was no time to remove his boots. I pulled down his plain white underpants, exposing him completely. We were under the tree, out of sight from the road or any nearby homes. I bent his knees outward to position him, making his private parts fully accessible. With precision, I wrapped a tight ligature around the base of his organ, pulling the loose skin back to ensure full control. I wanted him to heal, but without the weapon he had used to damage others. With my sharp number 15 surgical blade, I made the cut, slicing through until only less than half an inch remained. The ligature prevented significant bleeding. I placed the severed organ on his chest, leaving it there momentarily as I continued my work. I quickly poured a 10% silver chloride solution over the stump as an astringent. Time was crucial. Working swiftly, I tied another ligature around his testicles, securing it tightly. With a quick slice through the skin of the scrotum, I exposed the left testicle and pinched it out, just as I had done with young pigs on the farm in Colorado when I was a boy. I tied a clean cotton string around the testicle in triple knots, securing it with another layer for extra hold. I used the knife to separate it from its attachments, then poured the astringent solution over the base, trimming the string short. The scrotum naturally came together with only slight assistance. Henry would live the rest of his life without his organ and with only one testicle. I was satisfied with my work. I placed the severed organ in a plastic bag filled with formalin to preserve it. I then removed the ligatures, ensuring there was minimal bleeding, just as planned. I packed my supplies into another plastic bag. To make my message clear, I tied his testicle around his neck. I considered putting it in his mouth, but decided against it. He could choke or aspirate, and I didn't want him dead yet. I wanted him to live and face his new reality without his manhood or the testosterone-driven urges it fueled. I wondered what Susan would think. The thought made me chuckle. This was justice, served with precision and care. I didn't wait for Henry to wake up and react. I didn't need to. Delaying gratification is a sign of maturity, and I prided myself on being mature. I gathered everything from my makeshift station, smoothing the disturbed dirt. For the final touch, I left a written note between his legs, placing the single testicle on top of it as if it were being served on the white plastic sheet. I was certain news of this act would spread quickly through town, but it would reach me indirectly. I would know nothing of any chaos in the Utah desert. I packed everything into 2 large black trash bags. I put on my coveralls and fake beard. I made sure my size 13 footprints were evident before leaving. I did a final check to ensure nothing was left behind. Everything was in order. If there was an investigation, I wanted the evidence to suggest a large, slightly lame man. I wanted the avenging angel to bear the face of Ethan Allen. With an exaggerated limp, I crossed the quarter-mile field to the old rental car parked on the back road. I loaded everything into the trunk, scanned the area for witnesses, and confirmed that my supplies were secure. No one was around. I drove away, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The drive back to Colorado was peaceful and uninterrupted. The mission was complete. When I got back, I destroyed all evidence. My worn clothing, the tool, and the beard were soaked in a mix of water and kerosene, then burned and buried in the desert. The car's original tires were put back on, and I returned it to the rental agency. The stolen Colorado license plate was buried, and the 4 old tires were sold by a bearded man wearing gloves in eastern Utah. From there, I took a taxi to the airport and boarded a flight to South Africa with my fake passport and ID. My SUV stayed in storage, untouched. During the flight, I reflected on the message I had left for Henry. It was written in 17th century English, matching the language of the King James Version scriptures he cherished. It read, Page 1, Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Page 2, Thou hast sinned. The devil sent his messenger to thee, and thou did listen to him instead of me, God. Page 3, Thou shalt test the spirits to see if they are true. Thou did not test that spirit, and thus thou were led astray to lust after Ethan Allen's wife. Page 4, Thou had carnal knowledge, which I forbade. Page 5, I have heard the cries for justice from my servant Ethan Allen. Page 6, Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord of hosts. Page 7, If thine eye offends thee, pluck it out. It is better to be blind than to suffer the pain of end of life in hell. Page 8, My avenging angel has saved thee from eternal damnation by removing thy offending part. Accept thy judgment from thy God, lest I return in anger and pluck thine eyes out, so thou shalt not sin by lusting again. I slept soundly during the flight, the weight of my mission now behind me. Occasionally, I felt for my backpack where my trophy was securely kept. It was part of Henry, a reminder of this act of justice. The thought didn't disturb me. It brought a sense of peace. Upon arriving in South Africa, I met my friend, exchanged greetings, and handed him a generous bonus in gratitude. He returned to the U.S., while I continued to Angola as planned. We disposed of our cell phones in Africa, leaving no trace that could lead back to us. Henry's organ was a significant trophy, symbolizing the act. My work at sea kept me busy for the next 2 months, letting the events in Utah fade to distant rumors. When I returned to the States, I reached out to Susan's mother and others under the pretense of catching up. Susan had come back home, but she was different. She confessed that Henry had grown more violent after losing his manhood. She feared for her safety, while the other wives felt trapped, unable to see a way out. Susan had urged them to join her in leaving, but they had declined. My brothers were relieved when I shared Susan's story. They were glad justice had been served, though I neither confirmed nor denied my role. I attended the funeral of an old friend who had died from an accidental mix of booze and anxiety pills. We had partied hard, and I hadn't known he had started taking anxiety medication. The idea of eliminating Henry dissipated. Seeing him live powerless was far more satisfying than the silence end would bring. And I wasn't a violent man. Henry never pressed charges, accepting his fate as divine punishment for coveting another man's wife. Susan left him and moved back near her mother, who helped raise her child. Both became teachers and found some peace. Susan never finished her PhD. I thought of reconnecting with her, but couldn't bring myself to raise Henry's child. She never remarried, following a life path similar to her mother's. On what would have been our 10th anniversary, Susan received a package containing a preserved, shriveled human phallus with no return address. I thought it appropriate to return the trophy to the woman who once admired it. I no longer had use for it. My life was full, with love, a wife, and 3 children. The past had no place in it. In war, there are no true victors. Some lose more than others. I lost Susan. Henry lost his manhood and his wife. Susan lost her PhD, and in the end it was just Henry and me, bound by a tale of justice and retribution that left us all forever changed.